Making videos on specific topics is pretty fun to do. Honestly, I enjoy making videos on any topic, as long as the stories contain some form of entertainment or thrill. I think unintentionally, this channel has become a place for stories of all different kinds, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So tonight, I will be telling 6 stories that share absolutely nothing in common. I'm not going to give a rundown this time around, but I would like to remind you all that the titles and authors can always be found in the description. So if you'd like a sneak peek, the option is always there. If you'd like to keep the mystery, that's cool too. All 6 of these stories were entertaining in one way or another, with twists, turns, and some of the most bizarre stuff I've read in a while. A huge thank you to the incredible authors who allowed this video to be possible. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. I had been embarrassed to go to the amusement park alone. Amusement parks reek of togetherness, saturated as they are with sunburnt families, love-struck young couples, and sugar-high summer camp kids shepherded by underpaid counselors. No matter where you are in the world, the places are stomping grounds for day-drinking bachelor parties, bewildered tourists, and diehards who arrive in packs before the rides are even open. Even the surly teenagers with their water bottles full of cheap vodka are at the very least there with their friends. I was old enough that I shouldn't have been self-conscious of my solitude. In your late 20s, you're expected to be able to do things on your own, but I was, all the same, unwillingly experiencing that insidious little tug in the back of my mind, reminding me that I was the odd one out. I remember glancing around myself more than once, wondering if the people who swirled around me were judging me for being there by myself. This was last August, almost a year ago to the day. A little context is necessary, I think. See, my relationship with amusement parks has always been very love/hate. Deathly afraid of heights, I went on exactly 2 roller coasters over the entire span of my childhood, one at age 8, one at 13, both times resulting in me puking. The second time, I even fainted. Suffice it to say, I swore off of them, until college anyway, when my freshman year dorm organized a trip to a nearby theme park. There was this girl I liked, really liked. We'd written her name in careful cursive on the sign-up sheet tacked to our RA's door, so I signed up too. And when that same girl asked me to ride the biggest, scariest roller coaster with her, I, against my better judgment, agreed. She had screamed bloody murder and squeezed my hand so hard I thought she'd crushed it. I was scared out of my mind, and then as quickly as it had started, the ride was over. Somehow I hadn't passed out, vomited, or died. And I'd gotten to hold the hand of this really cute girl. That was when I started liking roller coasters. Slowly I became braver, and as I rode more coasters, I began to crave the adrenaline of a ride. That same kind of masochism that comes with watching a horror movie. Even though you know you're going to be afraid, I'll admit it, no matter how many roller coasters I go on, the rides still scare me shitless, but I love them. Or I used to, at least. Back to the trip last August. I hadn't intended to go alone. I was supposed to go with the same girl who'd gotten me to ride that roller coaster in college a decade earlier. We had reconnected a few years out of school, and I fell in love with her hard and fast. The fall every bit as exciting as the roller coasters she'd taught me to love. Being with her meant that I always had a hand to hold at amusement parks, which we went to a lot, but when a work emergency meant she had to bail out on our August trip, she'd insisted that I go on my own. The tickets were non-refundable, she'd told me. Go, you'll still have fun. So I went. I showed up early. The park was crowded, despite it being a weekday, but I stood in every line and went on every ride I could, slowly working up the courage to go on the grand dame of them all, Excelsior. Excelsior was a jaw-dropping behemoth of steel and iron that cut into the sky like a blade, dwarfing all other rides in the park. A sign at the entrance blared the coaster's praises. It was 418 feet high, the 3rd tallest in the world. It had a 120-degree drop, a dizzying number of loops, an acceleration that would make a race car driver jealous. At the bottom of the sign, there was a fine print warning. This coaster was not for the faint of heart. The park made that abundantly clear. For a long time I stood by the gateway, staring up at Excelsior. It was fascinating to look at. Segments of it were painted in the amusement park's trademark royal purple, while the rest of it was cast in cold silver. The color scheme combined with the ride's convoluted twists and turns made it look like an incomprehensibly large piece of abstract art. It took my breath away. I had to ride it. I had to. I decided in advance that I'd buy the overpriced photo that would inevitably be taken at the ride's most climactic moment. That photo that would be my trophy, my proof that I'd conquered my fears once and for all. Hell, maybe I'd even spend the $25 to get the picture printed on a mug. This would be my rite of passage. My mind made up, I joined the masses passing through the arched gate, and took my place on the queue. The coaster was a 4-minute ride, give or take a few seconds. And so the snaking line crawled. With every step forward, my stomach twisted painfully, warning me, urging me to turn back. I'll admit, I was tempted to bail several times, but I didn't. I had no one to talk to while I waited, and was too nervous to play games on my phone, so I people-watched to pass the time. Amusement parks, it turns out, are always full of bizarre characters. A couple with matching jet black haircuts and heavy eyeliner stood behind me, absolutely silent and probably unbearably hot in the head-to-toe leather they were wearing. A little further back was a woman dressed as though for a Renaissance fair, though there was nothing even remotely Renaissance related at the park, and the large group in front of me were all there together. Their matching neon pink t-shirts were a dead giveaway. They reminded me of the shirts kids wear on field trips to make sure they don't get lost. Garish and fluorescent, but very easy to spot. This group, however, was entirely adults as far as I could tell, so it wasn't a kids' camp, but perhaps a family reunion or maybe a church group. The latter, I decided, was probably it. The line moved at a glacial pace, and eventually boredom began to tug down the corners of my fear. I turned my attention back to the flock of pink in front of me. The back of their shirts were emblazoned with a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked sort of like the aperture of a camera, but the pieces were all disjointed and spread apart. Beneath the symbol was today's date. I almost asked about the symbol, but I found myself suddenly shy. What if they thought I was weird for being there alone? So I kept my mouth shut, instead trying to see what was on the front of their shirts. I must not have been very subtle, because one of the men caught me staring, and I felt my cheeks immediately burn. Instead of telling me off for ogling them, the guy flashed me a genial smile. This is going to be fun. I tried to return the grin, but only managed a bit of a grimace. The man clapped me on the shoulder warmly. You're going to make it through. Don't worry. He grinned at me again. His teeth were dazzlingly white, but his smile was marred by a missing tooth. The third tooth from the front left, the upper cusp, I think it's called, was gone. How strange, I remember thinking. The man seemed fit and clean cut, but must have taken very good care of his teeth to have them that blindingly white. I found it odd that someone like that wouldn't have a missing tooth replaced, especially when the hole it left was that unsightly. I reprimanded myself for my mental criticism. Who was I to be judgmental? I was the one alone at an amusement park after all. All too soon, we were at the front of the line, the sea of pink shirts and me. As the church group slowly filled up the train, I felt my stomach plummet, the familiar fear rushing back. I silently prayed that I wouldn't be on this round of the ride. I needed just a few more minutes to steel my nerves, just a few more minutes, and then I'd be ready. But the imaginary god I prayed to didn't answer, and the very first car remained unfilled. A youngish couple, maybe in their 20s or early 30s, took the 2 seats in the back, leaving the very first row to me and another solo rider. As I walked forward, dread mounting within me, I did a quick mental passenger count. 9 cars, 4 seats each, 36 people total. Most of that was a sea of pink. I finally got a good look at the front of their shirts as I passed, which turned out to just be blank. Disappointing, but whatever. Ink is expensive, or something. I walked by the guy who had smiled at me. He was seated next to a pretty blonde woman, his wife maybe, who was smiling at him. It would have been a beautiful smile, were it not for the hole where the upper left cusps should have been. I tripped on a knot in the wooden floorboards, whipping my head around to make sure I'd seen what I thought I'd just seen. The blonde woman was laughing, the gaping hole a blight on her pretty face. A couple missing the same tooth. What were the chances? The laughing woman caught my gaze and winked at me. An inexplicable chill jolted through me, prickling my skin. Bizarre, I thought. How freaking bizarre. The grinning couple was quickly forgotten as I approached the coaster's frontmost car. My car. Swallowing the heavy lump in my throat, I climbed into the seat and snuck a look at my co-rider. She looked to be about my age, and I wondered if she felt as weird being alone as I did. She grinned at me, and I laughed nervously as I pulled down my over-the-shoulder restraint. Grateful that she, at least, had all of her teeth. I shivered, not sure whether it was from nerves or from an unexpected gust of the brisk, almost autumn air. I checked my watch, 4 p.m. The day had been pleasantly warm, but now it was just the slightest bit chilly. I was glad I'd brought a jacket, as the thin t-shirt I had underneath it offered little warmth. Even the park employees were wearing sweatshirts now, in the theme park's signature royal purple. I pulled down on the over-the-shoulder restraint once, twice. It clicked satisfyingly each time, meaning it was secured. I yanked it down a third time, just in case. Click. The park employee came by in his purple sweatshirt, looking bored as hell. I didn't blame him. And nevertheless, diligently checked each of our restraints once more. We were locked in. I couldn't resist a final check. Click. Scared? The girl next to me asked. Terrified. You? Oh, I'm... Before she could finish her sentence, a blaring alarm split the air, and we were off. The train lurching away from the platform. For a moment, I felt lightheaded. There would be no turning back now. I was past the point of no return. It was happening. I was actually doing this. My car was the first to clear the covered loading pavilion, and as we slipped into the sunlight, I glanced to my right. The ride operator stood in a cramped little control booth, waving us off. I was struck, for a moment, by him. One purple sweatshirt-clad arm was waving enthusiastically, but the expression on his face was inscrutable. He couldn't even have been as old as me, but already his furrowed brow was creased by lines that were too deep for someone his age. His lips were pressed tightly together, like he'd just tasted something sour. It must suck being stuck pushing buttons in a stuffy little space all day. I thought, at least he gets to ride for free. As the train slowly climbed to the top of the first drop, my heart slammed itself against my ribcage with such force that I was certain my co-rider could hear it beating. The crawling train summited, pausing for a second. I squeezed my eyes shut. I took a deep breath, and before I was ready, we plummeted. I remember the feeling of the G-forces yanking my skin backwards, forcing my eyes open and splitting my face into a scream. The speed held my face in a mask of horror as we climbed, dropped, inverted, and plunged again. The first loop-de-loop almost made me shit myself, and the second one was even scarier than the first. I couldn't even catch my breath, yet the ride sped faster and faster. Faster than I'd ever gone before, faster than I could even believe was possible. The girl beside me was shrieking with laughter. I, admittedly, was just shrieking. We screamed toward a third loop, the biggest yet. It was so large that it seemed impossible to traverse, but we barreled toward it all the same. As we soared into the sky, I felt my soul detach from my body, succumbing to the euphoric freedom of being on a journey I couldn't control, no matter how badly I wanted to. My screams of terror turned to screams of excitement. This is what it means to feel alive. And then on the fourth loop, at the crest of the inversion, we stopped. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind. It was tranquility in the most unlikely of places, and for the first time since the ride's initial drop, I was able to take a proper breath. As air filled my lungs, the reality of the situation began to sink in. My stomach plummeted, nausea rising within me. Panic began to distort my vision, threatening to consume me. I forced myself against the feeling. We were stopped upside down. I told myself, just stopped, not falling. Roller coasters could stop, but they never fell. They never fell, right? I forced myself to inhale on a 3 count, and then exhale in the same way. Hyperventilating was the last thing I needed to be doing now. I heard the couple behind me giggle nervously. Was this part of the ride? Hey, you okay? The girl next to me's voice trembled. Yeah, you? I think so. I don't think this is part of the ride. I didn't either. Not anymore. On the ground, people were beginning to notice that something was amiss. Crowds were beginning to gather. The people looked like beetles from so high up. A mass of insects swarming from all corners of the park. A tangle of bodies, all with their faces turned skyward, looking at us. As I forced myself to continue taking even, steady breaths, I tried my best to remain calm. I told myself that the chance of being injured on a roller coaster was 1 in 24 million. I knew. I looked it up multiple times, and that there were dozens of fail-safes in place to prevent accidents in situations like this. Even stuck upside down, it was literally impossible for the train to become detached from the tracks. The risk of anything bad happening to us at all was next to zero. The worst thing would be that one of us would have to pee before the roller coaster began again. I grimaced despite myself. Now that would be embarrassing. Far below us, a small army of purple sweatered figures were running towards the control booth. Good, I thought. They'll fix this. We'd be back on the ground in no time. I thought of my girlfriend. She was going to lose her mind when I told her. I took a deep breath again. It would all be over soon. Click. I didn't see the restraints come undone. My mind didn't process the click, or the soft thud of cushioned bars hitting metal. Time stopped as dozens of bodies passed through the air, gentle as falling leaves. I heard the splintering of flesh and bone breaking against earth, but the sound was somewhere far away, muted as though remembered from a dream. For a moment, there was silence. Perfect silence. And I was somewhere else, somewhere where things were calm and still and soft. Then a single scream pierced the air, another joined it, and then another, until the screams became a wall of sound that crescendoed upward, slicing through me and pulling me back to a world that had become noise, earth-shattering noise. And just like that, I was in hell. I was strapped in. I couldn't turn around, couldn't see how many people remained, didn't have the mental bandwidth to count the bodies on the ground. Bodies that looked like so many artists' mannequins that had been bent and twisted into impossible shapes. I tried to close my eyes, but I couldn't. Some unknown force was keeping them open, branding my memory with the image of neon pink shirts everywhere. That unfamiliar symbol winking up at me. Today's date on fluorescent backgrounds that were slowly turning red. The scene took on a surreal quality. Corpses littered the ground beneath Excelsior, the grass and asphalt soaking with blood. A short ways off, I could just barely make out a strange pink lump. I squinted at it. It wasn't until I noticed the man with his skull cleaved in two that I realized the lump was a brain. I felt my vision blur and sway, vaguely realizing that I was about to pass out. The last thing I remember seeing was movement. I fought to stay conscious, as I struggled to make out what the motion was. It was a body. One of the bodies was moving, a woman who should have been dead. She was lying face down in the stained grass, with both of her legs bending in the wrong direction. Her right arm was flailing, spasming, and scrabbling at the grass, pushing until her mangled upper body twisted, lifting ever so slightly off the ground. I felt bile rise in my throat. The woman's torso was no longer attached to her legs. I vomited, the contents of my stomach dropping hundreds of feet to join the bodies below. The woman stopped moving, and my vision went dark. The memories of what happened after are in fits and starts. Images seen as though from behind fogged glass that came to me, sometimes, in bits and pieces. I don't remember getting back down to the ground, but I remember someone pulling me onto the platform, putting a blanket around me. Everyone was screaming, people were crying, and the world smelled overwhelmingly of iron. Later we'd learn that only 4 of the 36 had survived. Me, the girl beside me, and the couple behind us. Ours was the only car that hadn't opened. I went into shock apparently, which is why my memory of the day is so patchy. My mind repressed most of it as a defense mechanism. Or so I've been told anyway. Still, some pieces of that day remain in focus. I can remember perfectly the contorted shapes of the corpses on the ground. I can draw them from memory. Their lifeless angles are seared onto the insides of my eyelids. I see them every time I close my eyes. There is one other piece of the day that I remember with crystalline clarity. I remember lying on the wooden floorboards, shivering uncontrollably despite the heavy blanket that was draped around my shoulders. I remember opening my eyes and seeing the train operator, the same one from before, unmoving amidst the chaos. The inscrutable look on his face was gone, replaced by an entirely different expression. He didn't look scared. He didn't look sad. He looked dead, like any light that may have burned behind his eyes had been extinguished. I remember looking up at him as he walked past me. I remember watching him walk away from Excelsior, even as everyone else was running towards it. And I remember one more thing. From underneath his royal purple sweatshirt, the fabric of a t-shirt was peeking out. A t-shirt that was neon pink. My husband went overseas as part of the military for a few years. The entire time I anxiously awaited his return. I constantly wondered if I would ever get a phone call notifying me that he would never come home. It was strange being alone in this big house for so long, but I got by. As the end of my tour neared, my days were consumed with preparation. Every day had to be in perfect order for him. It had to be just right. In an unexpected twist of fate, I did get a call a week before he was scheduled to return. My husband wasn't dead, but he was very badly hurt. I didn't want the gruesome details, but he lost his legs and suffered a bad head injury. They told me to expect changes in his memory and behavior when he came back. They explained that recovery was a long road, that he needed a lot of support from me, and a lot of other stuff I'm sure they've told to countless spouses waiting back at home. Even knowing all this, nothing could prepare me for what was coming. By the time I was finally going to be able to see him, I had practically picked my fingers raw from anxiety. He had to be medically stable enough to ship back, so I wasn't expecting the worst. But I clearly wasn't expecting the best either. I was scheduled to meet him at a doctor's appointment so they could go over all the details with me. I have never been fond of hospitals, or doctors, or anything like that, so this certainly wasn't how I wanted to see my husband for the first time. My anxiety was debilitating, but I knew he needed me, so I swallowed my apprehensions and urged myself through the doors. I signed in, and the doctors met me in the office soon after. He gave me essentially the same basic rundown I'd heard before. I would notice deviations in my husband's personality. He'd probably forget some things. He had made a lot of progress, but there was still a long ways to go in terms of both physical and mental recovery. I tried to pay attention, but I was so nervous to see him that his words all seemed to blur together. The doctor stopped abruptly to knock on one of the doors stretched along the hallway. "Mr. Hart, I have your wife here. I'm sure you're very excited to see her." He flashed me a big smile before opening the door and ushering me into the room. He looked just like I remembered, just like all the big glossy pictures that line the hallways of the house. With the exception of his lower half, he sat in a wheelchair now, and both legs had been amputated above the knee. Their ends were concealed by tight bandages. The wounds are pretty healed by now. The bandages are just to keep the swelling down in preparation for future prosthetic fitting, the doctor reassured me. My husband looked up at me, disoriented and confused. His expression rapidly morphed into a look of rage. "That's not my wife," he said, glaring up at me. My heart seized in my chest. "Honey?" I started to say. The doctor cut me off. "Ryan, this is your wife. She provided ID at the front desk. Just look at her. You know this is your wife. You just showed me a picture of you two 20 minutes ago." He turned to me, a sorry expression on his face. I heard he had trouble telling the nurses apart in rehab, and he still gets confused sometimes. This is actually pretty normal. It'll get better as you talk to him. Remind him of all the memories you shared before all of this happened. My husband still looked a little skeptical, but I could tell he was at least somewhat aware of how his brain injury had affected him. He knew he wasn't all there anymore. The doctor educated me on how I could care for my husband and make sure he was safe around the house. There was a lot to remember, but I took careful notes. Finally, I was allowed to take him home. I sheepishly gripped the handles of his wheelchair and pushed him out of the office. I helped him transfer into the passenger seat of my car before getting into the driver's side. I missed you, I finally cautioned after several heavy minutes of silence. Yeah, I missed you too, he replied, looking at me with a glimmer of recognition. I eased up a bit in my seat, hardly realizing I had been tensing my entire body. I hit the brakes a bit too hard as we approached a red light. We both lurched forward in our seats, straining against the seatbelts. Sorry, babe, I offered meekly. Brakes are a little touchy. You've had this car for years, he shot back, turning to look out the window. I know, just haven't been driving much lately, I returned with a sigh. I knew it was going to be difficult to get him to trust me. It's only gotten worse in the week since he's come back. The doctor has been no help. Every time I call, he writes my husband's erratic behavior off as a normal reaction to traumatic brain injury and probably PTSD. There are moments when he responds to logic, admitting that I must be his wife because I look exactly like he remembers. We flip through photo albums together each day and laugh over our shared memories. I fill in the gaps when he's forgotten something. We hold hands, and sometimes he even initiates a kiss. If I happen to forget the smallest detail, he remembers, or thinks he remembers really. A switch flips, and I know the chance for reasoning with him is gone. He can't seem to accept that it's normal for me to forget things too. Even more frustrating is his constant nitpicking over the small ways I've changed over the years. After spending so much time alone in this house, naturally I've picked up a few new hobbies. My husband can't come to terms with this fact, expressing disbelief in my sudden love of gardening the most. You hate the dirt, he snaps at me. You hate the way it feels under your nails. I still do, I reply, trying to keep my composure. Be patient, the doctor always says. That's why I wear gloves, honey. I like the feeling of growing something out of nothing. I get to plant my favorite flowers instead of buying them for the vases like I used to. Sometimes things are good, but most of the time, they aren't. It truly is one step forward and 2 steps back. Sometimes it feels like 20. The doctor says he's likely projecting. He feels so out of control of his own life that he needs to control mine. Be patient, he always says, as we end a phone call. And I scream internally each time. My husband wakes up screaming almost every night. Sometimes he lets me comfort him. Sometimes he won't. I know this is hard for him. He will often say something like, I don't get it. Logically, I know you are my wife. You have her eyes, her smile, her everything. You know everything about her. Everything about us. Oh God, the hell is wrong with me? I know he's broken, but I can't fix him. He is fundamentally different now. But I can build a life with this new man once he lets me in. Today is actually going pretty well. We laughed over coffee this morning, and he kissed me on my way out to buy some more bulbs for the empty patch in my garden. I've spent most of the day running errands, since I'm not able to get out much lately. I even stopped at the local winery to pick up my husband's favorite red. It will go perfectly with his favorite meal, which I'm planning to cook tonight. I try to guard my feelings these days, but I actually feel good today. That's why my heart sinks when my husband greets me from the kitchen with that god-awful phrase again. You're not my wife. Tears are streaming down his face, and he's holding an old family photo of me in one hand. He's not just angry, he's devastated. I move swiftly to his side, ready to embrace him, and give him the speech that is actually starting to convince him that yes, I am his wife. Babe, please, you know who I am. No, babe, I don't. You aren't my wife. He shouts, completely out of touch and beyond reason. It's at this point that I notice he's also holding his gun, low in his lap, pointed at me. Ryan, listen. I firm my tone, approaching him slowly. You don't know what you're saying. You get confused. You know this. His expression softens, and so does mine. He looks down for a moment. When he returns his gaze to meet mine, his features have contorted into the most deranged and savage look I've ever seen. He aims and shoots. I brace myself, eyes closing instinctively, and hear the bullet speed past me. It burrows deep into the wall, his poor spatial perception. Another effect of the head injury has saved my life. Terrified for my life, my primal survival instincts take over. In his confusion, I rush him with a knife resting on the counter. I plunge it deep into his chest, over and over again. Anger and frustration and disappointment bubble up, and magnify my fear response. I already hear the sirens waiting in the distance by the time I'm done. In this neighborhood, police arrive immediately when neighbors report shots fired. The police find me hysterical on the kitchen floor. I know my husband is dead, but the EMTs work on him anyway. After the EMTs clear me, the police take me in for questioning. Luckily, it's a pretty open and shut case of self-defense. They consider his condition. His doctor confirms that I have called countless times about his erratic behavior. They find gunshot residue on my deceased husband's hands. The neighbors confirm they heard him shouting at me before the shot was fired. They called because they feared for my safety. And so, they let me go. Back to that empty house again. I feel like a completely changed woman as I enter that house. I make my way back to the kitchen, floor still bloodied by my struggle, and drop onto the ground. And then I laugh. Just fucking laugh. Because of course this would happen to me. My life has been nothing but struggle, fighting to get by, and yeah, killing when I needed to. Nothing has ever gone my way. I've worked myself half to death, but my sister had everything handed to her. None of that ever came my way, of course. She was too much of a stingy bitch to ever think about me. So when she finally reached out to me after all these years, and I found out she'd married rich, was sitting pretty in this mansion while I slaved every day away just to afford the measly rent on my barely legal apartment, I just lost it. I thought, why shouldn't I take something for myself? Just this once. I mean, nobody, not even my sister, ever showed me any mercy. It was my turn. Her husband didn't even know about me. I was an embarrassment to her. Her failure of a twin sister. I think I just reminded her of what could have been. The miserable life that she could have led if things were just slightly different for her. I spent the following months praying that Ryan would die overseas. I analyzed every last picture in the house. I pored over her diaries. She was so self-absorbed she wrote down everything that happened to her. She made it so easy to assume her identity that I couldn't believe it took me this long to do it. I guess the sentimental old cow actually kept a picture of the two of us hidden away. That's what Ryan found, what finally sent him over the edge into attempted murder. I almost feel bad for him, but mostly I'm so infuriated that he couldn't just let me have this one thing for once. Why couldn't he just let me be happy? I was trying so hard. I took care of him every day and night. I spent so much time trying to get to know him, but he couldn't be bothered to put in any effort to do the same for me. Hell, I don't even like men. But I was still willing to give him a chance instead of just doing him in right away, like I did to dear old sis. Somehow, I still couldn't measure up to my perfect sister, even when I was her. I laugh so hard my eyes well up with tears and my stomach aches. I reach into a cabinet and retrieve that damn picture. The picture that broke the illusion. I managed to shove it in there as soon as I was finished with Ryan. I push myself up off the floor and walk weakly over to the stove. I flick the burner on and let that photograph burn. I gather the ashes of the last hint of my miserable old life in my hands and walk through the beautiful French-style doors into the sprawling and perfectly manicured backyard. I spread the ashes of myself, the self I don't want to be anymore, onto my beloved garden. I smile down at the beautiful bunches of hyacinths bursting up from the fertile ground. It was so kind of me to plant my sister's favorite flowers atop the pieces of her dead body. When I was 10 years old, my family moved into a new home. My father was a safety consultant for chemical manufacturers and helped make their facilities more efficient and less hazardous. His job took him all over the country, and we went with him. Consequently, we often found ourselves living in the empty rural areas where these factories were often built. The house we had moved into wasn't much different from the ones I was used to. It was old, rickety, and, as always, cheap. My room was a cramped and stuffy corner of the home, which always seemed either too hot or too cold. Most notably, the walls were made of paneled wood. You know what I mean. The kind with dark and light swirls and obscure little markings. During my first night there, I noticed that the wood panel directly next to my bed had an interesting pattern. There were two circles with a third, larger one situated beneath them. I couldn't help but think that it looked like two eyes and a gaping mouth. A face pressed into the very wood. It's important to note that I was a lonely child. No other kids lived nearby. My father was often busy with work, and I was homeschooled by my mother. She had previously been a teacher and taught me well. However, when she wasn't lecturing, it seemed like she was too busy for me. My father would return home late at night, eat, and go directly to bed. As a result, I was lonelier than ever before in that dark home of ours. To cope, I began talking to the face in my wall. I knew that children often had imaginary friends, and I figured it was fitting that I would have one too. I spoke to it every night, much like a diary, telling it about my day and my feelings. It was cathartic. I poured all of my emotions into that eerie little pattern, letting out all of my frustrations and worries. As time went on, something strange occurred. The face in the wall seemed to become more detailed and realistic. The eyes gained a sort of depth, and I couldn't help but feel its gaping mouth was slowly being stretched into a grimace. At first I dismissed it, but every day it appeared more detailed, more human-esque. That was when the breathing started. I went to bed one night, and in the darkness of my room I heard the sound of labored breathing. I jumped to my feet and turned the light on, only to find my room as it had been before, empty. And yet, when I turned the lights back off and laid down, I heard it again. I could have sworn it was coming from that face beside my bed. I went to my parents and told them about it, but they dismissed the sound as creaky pipes. We lived in an old house after all, and that's what old houses do. They make noise. Nonetheless, I became certain that the face breathed as it watched me sleep. I stayed up most of the night, but eventually drifted off in the early morning. Yet that breathing continued night after night. It became less labored and soon sounded like the easy breath of someone content to sit and watch. It unnerved me, but I grew to ignore it. However, I decided to stop talking to the face in the wall. I felt as if it actually listened to me when I did so. The thought sent chills down my spine. But then came the worst night of them all. I was drifting off to sleep when I noticed that the breathing had stopped. I became so accustomed to it that the silence in my room was deafening. Then came the voice. "Father," I heard from beside my bed. I jerked up and stared at the spot on the wall. It was too dark to make anything out, but I knew the face was there watching. "Why won't you speak to me anymore?" I sat there frozen in terror. I tried to respond but only managed a strange squawk. Something between a question and a terrified shout. "You have made me real in your mind, and thus I was born," the face said, its voice raspy. "And yet you do not love me. All this time I have listened to your troubles, but now you look upon me with fear." At that moment I found the strength to dart from my room. I went to my parents, who were fast asleep in their beds. I told them about what had happened, but in a half-awake state, they dismissed it as a nightmare and told me to go back to sleep. I stayed for a moment longer, insisting that I had seen something. My father fixed me with an angry stare and told me to go back to bed in a way that left no room for negotiation. I left but refused to return to my room. Instead, I elected to sleep on the couch. I could still hear it as I laid there. The thing called for me, begging for my attention. Eventually it resorted to cursing me, telling me that it hated me and that I should die. I stayed up all night shaking with fear. The next day I found the courage to cover it with a poster in the brightness of the midday sun. It seemed that the face was only active at night. I had never heard it breathing during the day, and in the sunlight it seemed much less real. However, it still spoke night after night. Rather than bemoaning my lack of attention, it went straight to insulting me and saying how much it hated me. I slept in fear on the couch every night. Fortunately, my father's work there was nearly done, and we moved out shortly after. The face weighed heavily on my mind for months after that, but slowly I forgot about it. Eventually it seemed like nothing more than a distant dream, and I questioned whether it had ever really happened. However, 15 years later something strange has begun to occur. It started when I was sitting in my office at the accounting firm. I glanced down at the wooden floors only to see a face staring up at me. It was nearly identical to the one that had been in the house all those years ago. It had the same strange detail, the same wide grimace, and a new hatred burned behind its eyes. I nearly fell out of my seat upon seeing it. However, I convinced myself it was merely a coincidence, and went about my day. I tried to ignore it but couldn't stand the thought of that thing looking up at me. So I laid a paper on the ground to cover it. My walk home in the evening took me through the park. That's when I saw the face again, staring out at me from the bark of a tree. There was still anger in its eyes. I sped up my pace only to see it again and again, gazing at me from every tree I passed. I turned my attention to the sidewalk and focused on my stride. As soon as I got home, I felt a jolt of terror run down my spine. I realized that my floors were made of wood with the same swirling patterns as my bedroom wall all those years ago. Keeping my eyes straight ahead, I went directly to my computer. I managed to find some records of that old house. It had been demolished only a few days prior in order to build a new mall. Now I can't stop seeing that face. It follows me wherever I go, day and night. It calls to me with vile rage and utter hatred, begging me to kill myself for all the things I've done to it. That thing is now free of the structure which bound it, free to haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm starting to lose grip of my sanity, and at this point, I can't convince myself that the things I saw were only a figment of my imagination. There's something very off about my neighbor. I've tried posting on several different forums for advice, but no one believes me, so this is my last resort. Let me start by saying that I'm a complete skeptic when it comes to anything related to the supernatural. In my whole 22 years of life, I've never once experienced anything out of the ordinary. I've always assumed it was superstitious bullcrap, or stories you tell your younger siblings to scare them. So when I first caught a glimpse of my new neighbor, Jacqueline, I wasn't alarmed in the slightest. Jacqueline moved in across the street about 3 weeks ago. Looking back on the whole situation, I guess it was pretty strange. I hadn't seen a single moving truck, let alone Jacqueline herself. It seemed like one day she was magically there, just like that. Over the weeks, I hadn't seen Jacqueline even once. Our tight-knit community had begun to start rumors, and as curious as I was, I respectively decided to not make any assumptions. Throughout the week, I couldn't help but worry about Jacqueline. I know that some people like their privacy, but the more I thought about it, the weirder it seemed. I figured that Jacqueline needed groceries and had to have left to get food at some point. As I became more and more concerned, I made the decision to introduce myself to her. I knew the other neighbors had already tried to do the same, but I thought, what could go wrong? And everything could go wrong. To help paint a better picture, I live in a cozy suburban neighborhood. My house a white picket fence, one-story home, with a large floor plan and a beautiful front yard. From my front yard, I have a perfect view inside of Jacqueline's living room. And before you try to be a funny guy, I'm not a pervert, I swear. Back to the night, I decided to introduce myself to Jacqueline. I walked out of my front door and began to walk down my front steps towards the gate. I saw that Jacqueline's porch light was on, but something was different. Since Jacqueline moved in, her curtains had stayed shut, but tonight, they were drawn back. Through the window, I saw what I assumed to be Jacqueline in her living room. Now this would have been completely normal, if it weren't for the fact she was in a handstand. I couldn't see Jacqueline's face. The only thing in view were her legs. I figured that Jacqueline was a gymnast or something, and maybe she was doing some weird yoga pose. Whatever she was doing, I didn't want to bother her since she seemed busy, so I decided to head back inside and try again tomorrow. The next morning was a Saturday. I went about my day as I normally would, and around 6, I figured I would finally initiate the long-awaited introduction. The sun was setting soon, and I didn't want to wait too long. When I went outside, Jacqueline's curtains were still open, and this time I caught a full view of her. What I saw shook me to the core. This time, Jacqueline was further away from the window, her back facing towards me in her foyer. At first, I thought she was doing yoga or gymnastics again, but something was wrong. What I was looking at wasn't human. The first thing I noticed was that Jacqueline looked extremely malnourished. Her skin stretched over her bones, her joints protruding, making her look like a skeleton. Veins covered her dark white skin, making her appear almost translucent. The second thing I noticed was that this thing wasn't standing on its hands, but rather balancing on its fingers. The impossibility and ridiculousness of the situation paralyzed me. I was sure it was an illusion, or that I was finally having a psychotic break. In the midst of trying to convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't real, it moved. In a matter of seconds, the creature's head snapped backwards, its neck at what had to be a 90-degree angle. Its face was something I could barely comprehend. Jacqueline's, or whatever that thing is, eyes bulged out of its skull, darting wildly between me and her front door. What little hair Jacqueline had on her head dangled in front of her eyes. making her look like an even more demented golem. My mind screamed at me to run back inside, jump in my bed, and hide under my covers like a child, but my feet wouldn't budge. Jacqueline made a beeline for her front door, and I just about crapped myself. My fight or flight responses kicked in as I watched her lower body contort into something ungodly, using her fingers to make her way to the door. In a panic, I propelled myself to my own front door, locking it as fast as my trembling hands could manage. I quickly turned off all my lights, making sure Jacqueline couldn't see where I was in my house. I watched through my window as the creature, still walking on its fingers, made its way across the street towards my house. Its head was still bent at a disgustingly unnatural angle. Its spine was curved so far back its feet hung in front of its face. I was frozen in pure terror as I watched Jacqueline approach my front gate. Her mouth began to open, wider and wider until I thought her jaw might actually come unhinged. She began to lift her right arm, but the movement was wrong in every way imaginable. An audible crack could be heard through the safety of my front door. Her movements were jagged, like she hadn't moved her arms in a long time. I nearly crapped myself a second time as she began to lift herself over the top of my fence, all with her fingers. As of now, I've locked myself in the bathroom and haven't left in hours. I know I can't hide in here forever, and I can't bring anyone else into this without risking them getting hurt or worse. All I know is that thing is not human. I don't know what to do. Jacqueline managed to get into my house. I don't know how, but she knows I'm in the bathroom. Through the door, I can hear her ragged breathing. She's waiting for me. There aren't any windows, and I don't think she's going to leave anytime soon. After all those weeks without leaving, I think she might be hungry. I know you guys will take me seriously, so help me out. How do I not become a 3.5-star meal for a finger-walking acrobatic golem? Don't worry guys, the trail is a short loop. This was the sentence that got my cousins, sister, and I hopelessly lost on a wet and muddy mountain trail mere hours before dark. The sentence that led all of us but one to leave our phones in the car. The sentence that has now become the butt of many jokes between us, but only after we got back to our cabin. The sentence that ensured that I would never go hiking again. And the sentence that was the reason I can't sleep tonight and why I'm writing this in the first place. Because now I know there is something out there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This all started during my extended family's annual vacation. This year, it was decided that we would be renting a huge cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Georgia for a couple of days. The cabin was rather isolated and was at the base of one of the mountains. This particular mountain was absolutely covered in trails of all kinds. My extended family is quite large, so it didn't take long for my sister, cousins, and I to get irritated with the constant noise of our younger cousins, 9 and 6 years old, running around and trying to involve themselves in everything we would do around the house. Ever tried to play pool with a 6-year-old? Trust me, it's not fun. Putting a pool stick in their hand is just a recipe for disaster and injury. That was the reason that the 4 of us went out on a trail that day. It was me, my sister Sarah, and my cousins Danny and Will. It was Will's idea. He was an avid hiker and had been eager to go out on a trail since the day before when we arrived at the cabin, and he already had a trail picked out. Don't worry guys, the trail is a short loop. He announced as we stood at the entrance of the trail. I think it's supposed to rain today, I said nervously, looking up at the dark gray clouds. Not wanting to ruin my phone or my shoes if the trail got muddy. It won't be a problem, Will said assuringly, but nonetheless, Danny, Sarah, and I threw our phones in the car, not even wanting to risk it. Thankfully, Will kept hold of his. So we set off on the trail at about 3 p.m. We would be on the actual trail for about an hour and a half, and then lost in the woods for almost 4 hours. The first hour wasn't bad. The rain held off for a bit as we hiked the steep path up the mountain. As much as I hadn't wanted to go in the first place, I was actually having a good time. As someone who spent a lot of time online reading horror stories, I was even teasing Danny about skinwalkers in the woods, wendigos, black-eyed children, and anything else I could think of. I don't think I was scaring him that bad though. I'm pretty sure he was only worried about running into a bear or something. 30 minutes later, we reached a clearing on the trail. This looks like the end of the trail. I don't think it's a loop, Will. Danny said to his older brother, who looked a bit confused. No, I know for a fact that it's a loop. The map said so. Sarah pointed to a sign. It does look like this is the end. Thinking back on it, I don't think the sign said anything too important. I'm pretty sure that it was just historical facts about the area, but I was also pretty sure that the sign marked the end of the trail. No, Will insisted. It's a loop, see? He pointed to a trail a bit to the left of the sign. I think that's a different trail, I muttered. But my grievance went unnoticed by Will, who confidently strode to the trail and began walking down it. The three of us knew we couldn't exactly leave him to wander the trail alone. So instead of turning around, like Danny and I had suggested multiple times, we followed. As we entered the trail, there was a loud clap of thunder and the rain started to pour down. We'd been walking for 2 hours when you could tell that Will and Sarah were starting to get as nervous as Danny and I. Let's turn around, Danny suggested. Even if it is a loop, I don't think we're going down the mountain. We're still going up, and we need to get back soon. Will sighed in defeat. Fine. We all turned around and began walking back down the trail. We walked in silence. The only sound was the pouring rain hitting the leaves on the trees, and our shoes sticking and getting unstuck from the mud that the rain had turned the dirt trail into. It wasn't long before we ran into a problem. The trail split off into 2 paths, and we had no idea which one we came down. We tried the left trail, which then split off into 2 more paths. Before we knew it, we were hopelessly lost. It wasn't even 20 minutes later that we realized that we weren't alone either. Oh, don't worry guys, it's a loop, I said, mocking Will's upbeat tone from earlier, only half jokingly while making a mental note never to hike with him again. We're not lost, he insisted nervously. I can use my phone to find out where we are. I have an app that maps out trails. He pulled out his phone and opened the app. According to the app, we weren't even on a trail. The blue dot that marked our location was in the middle of a green patch that signified woods. We couldn't even see any trails on the screen. Ah yes, the green trail. I guess to get out, we just have to follow the green. Danny commented dryly. However, what worried us the most on Will's phone was the tiny black number in the top right corner of the screen. The battery percentage, 8%. As Will tried to locate a trail or a road on his phone, we all continued walking. The constant rain had stopped by then, leaving the woods absolutely silent. That's when Danny noticed something. Do you guys see that? He asked hesitantly, slowly lifting his arm to point down into a ravine that we were walking parallel to. Sarah and I turned to look into the ditch, while Will just spared a quick glance and just went back to trying to find a way out of the woods on his phone. We had trouble finding what he was pointing at as we scanned the tree line in the dim light of the quickly setting sun. Then we saw it, a dark, distorted human-shaped figure standing at the base of the ravine in between 2 small trees. It looked fuzzy. I didn't really have a clear outline and it kind of glitched as it stared back at us. Its arm would jerk quickly, and then its head would twitch sideways for only a millisecond before it went back to normal. Although it looked human, it didn't appear to be male or female, and as if it couldn't get any creepier, I saw its eyes. It had huge human eyes, the whites of them standing out starkly against its dark face. It began to make a low but loud whining sound as we continued staring. Frozen in fear and disbelief, the thing had no mouth, but anyone could tell that it was smiling by the gleeful look in its eyes. Hey guys, there's a road near us. We just have to... Will stopped, realizing that the 3 of us were just staring horrified into the ravine. What are you guys staring at? He asked, seemingly irritated that we were ignoring his discovery. He looked down to where we were looking and screamed. The thing's head twitched in his direction and its eyes fixed onto his. Strangely enough, his scream actually shocked us out of our frozen stupor, and Danny grabbed his brother's arm and we all sprinted down the still muddy trail, not even caring where we were going. As we ran, Will regained his bearings and began to direct us towards the road. I turned to see if the thing was following, and unsurprisingly, it was. We never really saw it move, beside the glitching thing it had going on, but there it was, on the trail where we had just been standing, still staring at us, still smiling as we ran. The whining sound continued at the same volume and pitch, no matter how far away we got from it. After it seemed like we had been running on the trail forever, Will called out for us to cut through the trees. We crashed through the undergrowth for a while, focusing so hard on not tripping, we almost didn't notice the river that appeared in front of us. Without hesitation, all 4 of us stepped in, wading our way across the churning, fast-moving water. We all clambered out, completely soaked, but we felt somewhat safer, even though we could still hear the whining. That was before we turned to look back across the river. There it was. We could see a bit clearer now that it was closer. It looked a bit taller than Danny, probably just under 7 feet tall. Its wide, white, human-like eyes seemed to glow in the now darkened woods. Its cheerful smile was still evident in its eyes, and it was glitching more often now. It was even blacker than the dark forest around it, seeming to pull the shadows from the forest floor and from the trees as it stood there. The whining sound started to get even louder than it was before, and it was almost painful at this point. Then it started to walk closer to the river. It had a really strange walk. If you've ever seen someone try to walk with a badly sprained ankle, you can get an idea of how it moved. Before it could even get to the edge of the water, we all just turned around and started running again. We could see a light beyond the trees of the woods, and we all sprinted towards it. We ended up in someone's backyard, just out of the woods, and Will shouted out that he could see the road. The source of the light that we saw was a street lamp, and all 4 of us took solace in the beam of light emanating from it. "Please tell me you still have battery on your phone," I pleaded, completely out of breath, as Will pulled his phone out of his pocket. 2%, he muttered under his breath as he quickly hit send current location to the huge family group chat. Not long after it showed up that the message had delivered, his phone screen went black. We had no idea where we were, no idea if someone was coming to get us, and we had no idea if the thing in the woods was still following. Not wanting to take chances, Danny and I kept watch on the part of the woods where we had come out of just minutes before. After about 20 minutes, all of us breathed a sigh of relief when we saw headlights in my mom's white SUV pull up to where we were waiting. We clambered into the car, my younger sister, Lindley, making fun of how we had gotten lost. We all just kept quiet as we pulled away from the street lamp. Danny turned around to look behind us, and when he turned back around, his face was white as a sheet. It was standing under the streetlight, just watching us. He shakily whispered to me as we drove even farther down the road. We never ended up telling anyone about the thing in the woods. Who would have believed us? We probably would have been lectured about making up stories to scare the kids. So we just said that we got lost while on the trail. Of course we blamed Will for getting us lost in the first place. We ate dinner, showered, and went down to the basement where we were all going to be sleeping. My sisters and I got the couch. Danny and Will got mattresses on the ground. I already said that the main reason I wrote this was because I couldn't sleep. There's a huge bay window facing the mountain trail where we got lost, and where we encountered whatever that was. Since it's so dark outside, we would never even see it coming. I was lying on the couch, wondering if it would follow us this far from where we had first seen it. The one thing that was bothering me was that I could still hear the whining noise in my head. I had really hoped it was just in my head. But then Danny asked, "Can you guys still hear that too?" I don't think any of us are sleeping tonight. I'm not going to get into how I got this job. Suffice to say, a friend of a friend. I never even met my own boss. I got a phone call saying I was hired and get my paycheck directly deposited every 2 weeks. It's pretty good pay too, so I'm not going to dig too much into it. But the warehouse, it's strange, man. It's on a hill at the edge of town, overlooking it. There's a small entrance on the side of the building that's locked with a combination that only I know. And I'm just supposed to come by every night to take a look inside. Make sure no teens are drinking in there. Some stupid stuff like that. There's something wrong with that building. First off, it's much larger than it looks, and well lit inside. Too well lit. Inside the warehouse, there's light coming from somewhere, but I can't really tell where. The ceiling is so high up, I can't see the top, even though you can tell there's a roof from the outside. And there are no windows, it's just endless white walls. I feel like I'm a cartoon character drawn onto an empty piece of paper whenever I'm inside. And it's entirely empty too. What the hell am I guarding it for? I made the mistake once of trying to find out how big the building was. I would follow the wall and try to reach one of the 4 corners, and I swear to God I walked for days and never reached it. I had to turn around and try to find the door I came in through. Thank God I was walking along the walls. It's weird because my phone's clock bugs out whenever I'm inside and stops working. It also has no signal, but that might be because I'm in the middle of nowhere. When I got outside again, my phone's clock would work again, and I'd later find out that I was inside the warehouse for less than an hour. But I could swear I was walking for what felt like weeks. I talked to my friends about this, and they all said that it was because I was high. And I'll admit it, sometimes I have an edible right before my shift starts. But get this, while I was inside, I never got hungry, never got thirsty, and never got an urge to pee, no matter how long I spent in there. I would walk farther and farther out every night, and whenever I came out, it's the same. I was inside for less than an hour. I didn't even know how I was making progress, but eventually I reached one of the corners. I tried keeping track of how many steps it took to reach the corner, and the closest estimate I could get is about 52,800,000,000,000 steps. I looked it up on Google. That's about the distance if you walked from the sun to the edge of the solar system. It should have taken me millions of years to walk that distance, but when I turned around and got back outside, less than an hour had passed yet again. I would venture in again and again, night after night, moving along the walls trying to find the corners of the warehouse, this white-walled nightmare where the light was coming from everywhere, yet nowhere. And I would eventually do it. I would reach all four corners, and then follow the wall back to the entrance of the warehouse. I estimated the size of the room to be roughly square-shaped, large enough to house 2 solar systems, and that doesn't even cover how tall the building space must be, since I can't see the ceiling. Sounds crazy, right? Clearly the edibles were tainted with some other stuff. Well, after months of just hugging the wall and walking in circles, I decided to walk to the center of the room. The warehouse was roughly square, so I had some idea where the center of the warehouse was. My biggest concern was getting lost and not being able to get back out. I knew if I could find a wall, I could just follow it and eventually find the exit. But people who get lost in deserts and forests unconsciously start wandering in circles, and in a space as large as 2 solar systems, that seems like a real possibility. But I got an advantage. I don't get hungry or thirsty inside there, and I seem to have infinite time, so there's good chance I'll make it to a wall, eventually. And that's what I've been doing for the past year. For the first couple of weeks, I would get lost. But when you have infinite time and infinite chances, well, it's only a matter of time before I got out again. Afterwards, I would even leave little road markers, some gum wrappers, empty soda cans, a can of paint that I splashed on the floor. I was amazed how I was able to find these markers consistently, considering they were billions of miles apart. And eventually I was able to make it across the room from one side to the other without needing to hug the wall. And eventually, I found it. I didn't even know why I was looking for anything, but it was a warehouse, right? It was right at the center of the warehouse, or close to it. I can't really tell. And the first time I saw it from a distance, I thought it was a marker I left behind. But as I got closer, it grew and grew until it was unmistakable. I stopped. There was a person there. A man. He was wearing a gray suit with brown pointed shoes with his back to me. There was a crunching sound as he was eating something, maybe an apple. But his arms were at his side, so he couldn't have been holding anything to his mouth. There was something wrong with him. I couldn't put my finger on it until he started moving towards me. His feet, his brown shoes. I was looking at the back of his head, but his shoes were pointed towards me. His knees and legs and feet were backwards, and as he shuffled in my direction, his neck began turning as to face me. Something told me to not look at his face as I turned and ran. A horrible wail escaped from the creature. I didn't look back. I did eventually make it out. I don't know when it stopped chasing me, but it seems that it does not like to leave that spot. I quit my job the next day. Not exactly. I couldn't get in contact with my boss, but I didn't go back to the warehouse again. The checks kept coming though. But you know what the strangest thing about all this is? I was getting ready for a job interview, because I'm not going back to that place, and I was going through my closet. Inside was a suit I haven't worn in ages. It was gray, with brown, pointed shoes. I had to write it. I had to. I decided in advance that I'd buy the overpriced photo that would inevitably be taken by... I decided in advance that I'd buy the overpriced photo that would inevitably be taken at the ride's most climatic moment. I decided in advance that I'd buy the overpriced photo that would inevitably be taken at the ride's most climactic point. I decided in advance that I'd buy the I decided in advance that I'd buy the overpriced photo that would inevitably be taken at the ride's most climactic moment. Yes. Okay. All right. The crawling train summited. The crawling train summited because... What is English? Why do I read? I can't even read. Like, why am I here? The crawling train submit... Oh my god. God damn it. Ugh. Summited. It's summited. It did not submitted. It did not summited. It did not do any of that. It did not summited. It summited. The crawling train summited, pausing for a second. I squeezed my eyes shut. I took a deep breath, and then, before I was ready, we plummeted. Oh my god. God damn it. Alright, let's get my bearings here. Okay. Plummeted. And before I was ready, we plummeted. Okay, alright, next line. Okay. As the end of his tour neared, my days were consumed with preparation. As the end of my tour neared, my days were consumed with preparation.